Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Western Flavors. Before we begin our new episode, we must take a moment to reflect on the heartbreaking and beautiful events of our last story. We watched as the family, having received the devastating news about Jack's health, gathered around their patriarch for his final days. The Dude Ranch Lodge was filled not with a somber silence, but with the warm and loving sound of a shared memories, as each family member said their own personal and poignant goodbye. The episode ended as Jack, surrounded by his entire family and with a final peaceful smile, retired to his room for the last time, leaving his loved ones to begin their long and final vigil. Now today, the family endures the longest night, a quiet and loving watch as they prepare to say a final, peaceful farewell to the heart and soul of Heartland. Grief is not always a storm. Sometimes it is a quiet and heavy and suffocating stillness, a silence that is louder than any scream. The Dude Ranch Lodge, a place that had been a sanctuary of a laughter and a life for so many years, was now a cathedral of a quiet and anticipatory grief. The fire in the great stone hearth had burned down to a bed of glowing red embers, its warmth a fragile and fading thing in the deep and profound and endless dark of the night. Jack's bedroom door was closed, and the family kept its vigil. No one spoke of it, but no one had made a move towards their own beds. They could not. They were a small and sleepless and heartbroken army, standing their last and most sacred watch. They were a family, bound by an unspoken and mutual pact to face the dawn and whatever it might bring together. Ty and Tim sat in the two large armchairs before the fire, the dying embers casting a warm and flickering glow on their faces. They did not speak. The old and complicated and often fractious energy between them was gone, replaced by a quiet and shared and deeply and respectful silence. They were just two men, two very different sons of the same, and great man, watching the last of the fire burn out. On the large sofa, under the soft and warm pool of a single lamp, Lou and Amy sat side by side, a thick and leather-bound photo album open between them. Lindy was a small and peaceful and blessedly unaware bundle, fast asleep with her head in her mother's lap. The two sisters turned the thick and heavy pages, their own quiet and whispered memories, a soft and gentle and heartbreaking counterpoint to the heavy silence of the room.
Look at this one.
Her voice was a raw and fragile whisper. She pointed to a photograph of two and very young and very muddy girls, grinning proudly beside a slightly exasperated but deeply loving Jack, who was holding a very small and very slippery fish.
I remember that. Grandpa spent the whole day teaching us how to cast, and all we wanted to do was make mud pies.
They shared a small and watery and deeply and sad smile. They were not just looking at pictures, they were holding on with all their might to the beautiful and ordinary and now impossibly and precious moments that had been the foundation of their entire lives. In the quiet corners of the room, the others kept their own and silent watch. Peter stood by the large window, staring out at the starless and black and indifferent night. Caleb and Scott sat at the dining table, a cold and untouched pot of coffee between them, their own faces a mask of a quiet and shared and deeply and sorrowful respect. And inside the bedroom, Lisa kept her own, and very private and most sacred vigil. The room was dark, save for the soft and gentle glow of a single small lamp on the bedside table. The only sound was the shallow and quiet and peaceful rhythm of Jack's breathing. He was asleep. She sat in the comfortable armchair she had pulled up beside the bed, her own hand holding his. She was not crying. The time for tears would come later. Now was the time for a peace, for a stillness, for a simple and profound and quiet and wifely devotion. She leaned forward, her voice a barely audible and deeply and loving whisper, a final and private conversation with the man who had been the great and unexpected and beautiful and quiet and wonderful love of her life. They all see the patriarch, the legend, the great Jack Bartlett. But I just see you, my love, my quiet and stubborn and gentle and wonderful man. You gave me a home, you gave me a family, you gave me a love I never thought I would find. You rest now. You've earned it. You rest. She brought his hand to her lips and kissed his gnarled and familiar and beloved knuckles, her own and quiet and silent tears finally, and gently beginning to fall in the sacred and beautiful and peaceful and hallowed silence of the room. The longest night finally and reluctantly began to bleed into the first pale and gray light of a morning. The fire in the hearth was now a cold and black and desolate landscape of a dead ash. The family was a collection of a weary and exhausted and heartbroken statues scattered around the lodge in the positions they had taken hours before. The vigil had taken its toll, the deep and profound and shared and loving exhaustion of physical and heavy weight in the still and quiet and somber room. The air was thick with the unspoken and collective and deeply and sorrowful knowledge that the world they had known their entire lives was about to change irrevocably and forever. The sound, when it came, was a small and quiet and simple thing, the soft and almost imperceptible click of a bedroom door latch. But in the profound and heavy and sacred silence of the room, it was a thunderclap. Every head snapped up, every heart seemed to stop in a mid-beat, every eye was fixed on the bedroom door. Lisa stood in the doorway, a still and solitary and heartbreakingly beautiful silhouette against the dim and gentle light of the room behind her. She did not speak. She did not have to. Her face, a mask of a profound and deep and shattering grief, was also and miraculously and beautifully a mask of a profound and absolute and quiet peace. She had walked with her husband to the very edge of his journey, and she had returned alone with the gentle and peaceful and loving and final and beautiful news of his safe arrival on the other side. The family saw her face, and they knew. The long and terrible and beautiful and sacred and loving vigil was over. A single and sharp and heartbroken and animalistic sob was torn from Lou's chest, a sound of a pure and raw and childish grief. Peter was at her side in an instant, his arms a strong and steady and loving shield as she collapsed against him. Amy's own hand flew to her mouth, her body shaking with the silent and violent and overwhelming force of her own and shattering grief, and Ty was there, his own arms a safe harbor, as she buried her face in his shoulder. Tim, the strong and stoic and often infuriatingly and resilient rock of the family, simply turned his face to the cold glass of the window, his broad shoulders slumping, a great and ancient and powerful tree, finally and completely and irrevocably broken by the storm. Lisa finally found her voice. It was not a cry, it was not a wail, it was a raw and quiet and beautiful and impossibly and steady whisper, a final and loving and beautiful report from a wife who had seen her husband safely home. He's gone. The words, so simple, so final, so absolute, were a confirmation of the terrible and beautiful and heartbreaking and peaceful truth they already knew. He just slipped away, a little while ago. In his sleep. It was so peaceful. He didn't feel any pain. He just let go. The patriarch was gone. The king had left his kingdom. The heart of Heartland had, finally and quietly and peacefully and beautifully stopped beating. The longest night had ended, and the first and coldest and emptiest and most difficult day of a world without Jack Bartlett in it had just and irrevocably and heartbreakingly begun. The initial and violent and tidal wave of a grief had crashed over them, and now, in its wake, there was a quiet and profound and aching and somber stillness. They were a family, huddled together in the cold and gray light of the morning, a small and shattered and heartbroken flotilla of survivors on a vast and empty and suddenly very, very lonely sea. The anchor that had held them all steady for a lifetime was gone. It was Lisa who, through her own and immense and deeply and private ocean of a grief, became their guide. She wiped her own and silent tears and looked at the faces of the family that Jack had loved so fiercely. He would want you to see him. Her voice was a raw and steady and beautiful and impossibly and strong whisper. He would want you to say goodbye. She turned and walked, with a quiet and dignified and wifely grace, back towards the bedroom. The family, drawing a strength from her own and quiet and unwavering example, followed. They moved not as a crowd, but as a slow and somber and deeply and respectful procession, on their way to pay their final respects to their king. The room was not a place of a death. It was a place of a profound and absolute peace. The morning sun was now streaming through the window, its gentle and golden light illuminating the dust motes that danced in the still air. The room was tidy and quiet and smelled of apacal, old books and a clean linen and a sunshine. And in the center of it, in his own and familiar and beloved bed, lay Jack Bartlett. He looked like he was simply in a deep and dreamless and contented sleep. The lines of a pain and a weariness and a worry that had been so deeply etched into his face for the last and difficult year, they were all gone, smoothed away by a final and gentle and loving hand. He looked peaceful. He looked free. Amy and Lou were the first to approach the bed. They moved as one, a single and unified and deeply and grieving entity of a shared and sisterly love. They stood on either side of him, and they each, in a silent and synchronized and beautiful and heartbreaking gesture, took one of his hands. His familiar and gnarled and weathered and rancher's hands, the hands that had built their home, that had healed their horses, that had held them when they were children, were now still and cool. They stood there for a long and timeless and silent moment, two granddaughters saying a final and tearful and loving and beautiful and silent goodbye to the man who had been the great and steady and unwavering and loving son in their own and personal universe. Tim stood at the foot of the bed, his own and large, and usually restless frame now completely and utterly still. He bowed his head, his gaze fixed on the familiar and worn and beautiful patchwork quilt that covered his father-in-law. He was a soldier standing at a parade rest, offering a final and silent and deeply and emotional salute to his commander, to his mentor, to the one and single man whose respect he had spent his entire and complicated and difficult life trying to earn. Ty stood by the door, a silent guardian. He watched his wife and his sister-in-law and his father-in-law say their goodbyes, and he felt the profound and heavy and sacred and humbling weight of the promise he had made on the high ridge. He was the patriarch now. He was the one who had to be the rock. He was the one who had to carry them all. And as he looked at the peaceful and sleeping face of the man who had given him that trust, he made a silent and solemn and deeply and personal vow that he would not fail him. It was Amy who, after a long and tearful moment, went to get Lindy. She knelt before her daughter in the doorway, her own voice a gentle and steady whisper.
Grandpa's gone now, sweetie. He's gone to be with the angels and with Great-Grandma Marion. We're just saying one last goodbye to his body.
Lindy looked past her mother into the quiet and sunlit room. She was not afraid. She just saw her beloved grandpa sleeping in his bed. She walked to his side, her small hand reaching out to touch his. Bye-bye, Grandpa. I love you. The simple and pure and beautiful and heartbreaking and perfect and childish and innocent words were a gift, a final and beautiful and perfect and loving and uncomplicated and pure and simple and beautiful and heartbreaking and perfect benediction. They quietly filed out of the room one by one, leaving Lisa alone for a final and private moment with her husband. They gathered back in the lodge, the raw and initial shock of their grief now replaced by a deep and profound and aching and somber and beautiful sadness. They had seen him. They had said their goodbyes. They had completed the first and most difficult and most sacred and most necessary ritual of a loss. And now they had to begin the next one, facing the first day of a new and unfamiliar and deeply and terrifying and lonely world. The sun was higher in the sky now, its light a bright and beautiful and almost cruelly indifferent presence in the quiet and grief-stricken lodge. The first and most difficult and most sacred part of their new and terrible journey was over. They had said their final and private goodbyes. Now, the heavy and necessary and public work of a mourning had to begin. The world had to be told. The patriarch was gone, and the ripple of his loss was about to spread far beyond the walls of this room. Lou, her own and personal, grief now carefully and necessarily compartmentalized behind the familiar and capable mask of the family's organizer, was the one to make the first call. She sat at the small desk in the corner of the room, her phone in her hand, and she dialed a number that was as familiar to her as her own. The voice that answered on the other end was sharp and professional and instantly recognizable. Stanton.
Val, it's Lou Fleming.
A moment of a surprised silence on the other end of the line. Lou, I wasn't expecting your call. Is everything all right? Lou took a deep and shaky breath, her own voice a quiet and steady and impossibly and difficult thing.
No, it's not. I'm calling to let you know. Jack passed away, peacefully, in his sleep, this morning.
The silence that followed was a different kind. It was not a silence of a surprise or of a business. It was a silence of a profound and genuine and deeply and human shock. When Val spoke again, the sharp and competitive and rival's edge was completely gone from her voice, replaced by something softer, something quieter, something that sounded, for the first time in a very long time, like a genuine and unadorned respect. "Oh, Lou, I don't know what to say. I am so very, very sorry. He was a great man, the last of a kind."
I know, I thought you should hear it from us. Before the news breaks.
"I appreciate that. More than you know? Please give my deepest condolences to Lisa and to your entire family. If there is anything, and I mean anything, that you need, Briar Ridge is at your disposal." The call ended, a quiet and simple and profound and beautiful and peaceful end to a rivalry that had defined the valley and their two families for a lifetime. Ty, now officially and quietly and heavily shouldering the mantle of the family's new patriarch, made the other and more formal calls. He spoke to Inspector Davies. He spoke to Mr. Al-Jamil, Prince Ahmed's quiet and professional, and deeply and respectful representative. He spoke to their lawyer. He was calm and clear and efficient, his voice a steady and unwavering thing, as he navigated the new and difficult and necessary waters of his own and new and profound responsibilities. The news, once released from the quiet sanctuary of the lodge, spread through Hudson with the speed of a wildfire. A phone rang in the warm and bustling and familiar space of a Maggie's diner. Maggie answered, her cheerful greeting dying on her lips as she listened. Her face fell. She hung up the phone, and without a word, she walked to the front door and slowly and reverently turned the open sign to closed. The quiet and respectful and deeply and understanding hush that fell over the diner was a more powerful eulogy than any words could ever be. Miles away, on a high and windswept and beautiful pasture, an old rancher, a man who had known Jack Bartlett his entire life, got a call on his cell phone. He listened for a long and silent moment, and then he slowly and respectfully removed his old and battered and beloved cowboy hat and held it over his heart, his gaze fixed on the distant and beautiful and now profoundly and emptier landscape of the Alberta foothills. The town, the valley, the entire and beautiful and rugged and wild and wonderful world that had been his kingdom, had begun to mourn its king. Late that afternoon, a sleek and black and familiar SUV made its way up the drive of the Dude Ranch. It was Val Stanton. She got out of the car, her own expression a mask of a quiet and somber and deeply and genuine respect. She did not come bearing a flowers or a condolences. She came bearing a gift of a pure and simple and practical and deeply and respectful support. She handed Lou a thick and detailed file. "This is a list of the best and most discreet funeral directors in the province, and a list of a caterers, and a security firms, should you need them. The press, they are going to descend on this place like a pack of wolves. You shouldn't have to deal with that. I've already taken the liberty of forwarding all calls to my own office. We will handle the media for you. It's the least I can do, for him." She did not stay long. She just gave Lou's arm a single and firm and deeply and understanding squeeze, and then she was gone. The family was grieving, and they were shattered. But in their darkest hour, they were beginning to see that they were not and would never be alone. A man's true legacy, they were beginning to understand, was not in the land he owned or the house he built. It was in the lives he had touched, and the life of a Jack Bartlett had touched them all. The sun began to set, painting the western sky in brilliant and heartbreaking shades of deep orange and soft purple. The day had been a long, grueling, emotional marathon, a journey through the first, most difficult, and surreal landscape of a new grief. The initial practical tasks were done. The world had been told. The quiet, intimate sorrow of the morning had been replaced by the shared, communal, and now palpable grief of the entire valley. The family was gathered once more in the main lodge, a collection of weary, emotionally raw, and profoundly exhausted souls. The outpouring of love, support, and respect from the community had been a comfort, a balm on their wounded hearts, but it was also a stark, powerful reminder of the sheer and irreplaceable size of the hole that had just been torn in the very fabric of their world. They were grieving, but they were not alone, and in some strange, beautiful way that made the grief even deeper, even more real. A quiet, contemplative, and deeply sorrowful peace had settled over the room. The initial shock was over. The hard, practical work of making arrangements was, for the moment, done. And now, in the quiet, somber, firelit twilight, they were left with the single, most daunting and terrifying and important question of all. What now? The family, a constellation of grief. instinctively and quietly, turned their gaze to the new reluctant and steady center of their own new and fractured universe. They looked to Tai. Lu was the one to give the unspoken question a voice.
So, what do we do now, Tai?
The question was a quiet, simple, and profound thing. It was an acknowledgement, a concession, a quiet and beautiful and heartbreaking and necessary passing of the torch. She was not asking as a sister. She was asking as a loyal and steadfast and supportive subject to her new leader. Tai looked at the faces of his family, at the people he loved more than his own life. He saw their grief and their exhaustion and their fear, and he saw their trust. He took a deep and steadying breath, the full, immense, and humbling weight of the promise he had made to Jack, settling over him, not as a burden, but as a sacred and honorable duty.
He asked me to do something. On our last ride, he asked me to make sure I lead you all home, and that's what we're going to do.
His voice was quiet but firm, and it was full of a new, powerful, and unwavering authority that was a comfort in the uncertain room.
First, we are going to give him the funeral he deserves, a farewell that this whole valley, this entire province will never forget. We are going to celebrate his life, and we are going to honor his name.
He looked at Lu, a quiet, shared, and deeply respectful acknowledgement of her own unique skills in bringing a community together. She gave a single, tearful, but resolute nod.
And then, after that is done, we are going to rebuild his home. We are going to fulfill the promise. We are going home for him.
The words, a simple, clear, and powerful mission statement, cut through the fog of their grief. It gave them a purpose, a path forward through the darkness. They were no longer just a family adrift in a sea of sorrow. They were a family with a sacred duty to perform. Later that night, the family stood together on the wide porch of the lodge, looking out at the vast and dark and star-filled sky. The air was cold and clean and carried the familiar scent of a pine. They stood in a comfortable and supportive silence, a small and battered but unbroken line of soldiers, surveying the world after a great and terrible loss. The end of an era had come. A legend had passed. But as they stood there, united in their grief and in their new and sacred promise, it was clear that his legacy was not gone. It was standing right here, on this porch, in the quiet strength of the family he had built, in the unbreakable bonds of the love he had nurtured, and in the steady and capable and honorable hands of the new patriarch he had chosen to lead them home.